Good evening, everybody. Good evening to all of those joining us on Zoom. And good evening to everybody on YouTube. I hope it was a wonderful Shabbat, and we are going to get started with a few texts. Of course, we're still in the Kedushat Levi, but tonight we are also going to take a brief detour to this book. It says Baal Shem Tov on it. Of course, the Baal Shem Tov is the founder of Hasidic Judaism, if you can really call him that. He didn't even know that he was founding a movement. We're going to read a text from that today, and we'll get to what that book is and that text in a bit. But first, we just read Parshat Va'etchanan, and I want to share two comments from the Kedushat Levi from Parshat Va'etchanan, and then one from the Baal Shem Tov. So, Shalom again, Yochev. By the way, I translated your last message, and yes, you can see my Portuguese is just as good as my Spanish. But I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you're joining us. Okay, we're going to jump right into it. Okay, Va'etchanan, this is the very first verse of the Torah portion. It says, Va'etchanan el Hashem, Va'etahu lemor. So this is Moses, who starts with and I prayed at that time to God, saying. Now Moses is going to go on and share, exactly what he was praying for, specifically to get into the land of Israel. But just this first verse, the Kedushat Levi has something to say. He says, Tevat lemor, hu meyutar. In that sentence, the word lemor, which is translated as saying, is superfluous. The text could have just said, Va'etchanan el Hashem ba'etahu, and I prayed to God at that time. And then he could have gone on about his prayer. So what is this extra word lemor doing? He says, V'hanir'eh, V'haperush hapasuk, Va'etchanan el Hashem ba'etahu. He says the explanation is, Shehaya mitchanen techila, Kedei sheyuchal lehitpalel achar kach. He says, I had prayed initially, back then, in order that I would be able to pray later. Lemor, he says, what this word is, lemor, he says, Perush hadavar shehaya tzarich lemor, ele shekodem lo haya yachol lemor. He says, lemor, it was necessary to say this word, because before, when I prayed to God, I wasn't able to speak. Lo haya yachol lemor. It was not possible to speak. Ki haya bosh milfanav yitzbarach. Because Moses was embarrassed before God. V'haya tzarich lehitzpalel sheyuchal lehitzpalel. And it was necessary to pray that he be able to pray. So the Kedushat Levi is translating this in a different way than our text is usually translated. He says, Va'etchanan el Hashem ba'etahu lemor shouldn't be translated as, and I prayed to God at that time saying. Rather, it should be translated as, and I prayed to God at that time to speak. Lemor, also the infinitive to speak. He says that Moses, at the time that he was going to pray to God to get into the land of Israel, he was embarrassed about his actions. Remember, he had just struck a rock, which condemned him to die in the wilderness and not enter the land of Israel. And he was embarrassed, and he still wanted to pray to God, but at the time, he could not pray to God. He did not feel like he had, the merit to pray. He didn't feel like he had any right to stand before God and ask anything. And so the Kedushat Levi says, at that time, Moses prayed to God that he be able to pray. That he someday, in the future, feel, proud of himself, feel ready, feel like he has merited the right to stand before God and pray. Now, I want to hone in on this because prayer can be extremely difficult. The idea of, and especially in Jewish prayer, when we say the Amidah, we take 3 steps back and 3 steps forward and are supposed to imagine ourselves before God, and that can be extremely intimidating. And here, the Kedushat Levi is giving us an in. If we don't know the words to pray, then there's at least one prayer that we have, which is, God, may it be that someday I feel proud to speak before you. May it be that someday I have the words to speak. Now, I also want to mention that this idea actually makes it into our liturgy. Before every Amidah, we say the words, Adonai sefatai tiftach ufi yagid tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips that my mouth may declare your glory. And it hones in on this, which is that there is a natural human tendency to not know how to pray, to not have the words to pray. And so even our rabbis, established in the Amidah itself, right before, an extra prayer, a short prayer, saying, help me feel proud before you so that I have the words to speak. So even if we have no idea what to pray today, at least you have that. You can say, God, someday, may I have the words, may I feel ready to stand before you and pour out my heart. Okay, text number 1. We're going to go on to one other text from the Kedushat Levi tonight, one other comment on this Torah portion, on Parshat Ve'etchanan. And keep your questions, comments, and concerns for the end. We'll open it all up at the end for comments. Now, this comes from still Parshat Ve'etchanan, chapter 4, verse 5. It says, Re'eh, this is still Moses talking. In fact, all of Deuteronomy is Moses talking. So, still Moses talking. Re'eh, limadati etchem, chukim u'mishpatim ka'asher tzivani Hashem Elohai la'asot ken bekerev ha'aretz. See that I teach you today statutes and judgments that God commanded me to do thus in the land of Israel. So this is Moses' comment. See today, he says, that I am commanding you that which God commanded me to command you. And the Kedushat Levi uses this as an opportunity to talk about mitzvot in general. He says, Yevo'ar al pi ma sheba'arnu. He says, actually, we have explained this before. V'ya'asu b'nei Yisrael ka'asher tzivah Hashem es Moshe. In the verse, and Israel did according to that which God commanded Moses. Haklal, he says, here's the general principle. Hashem yitzbarach amar leMoshe hamitzvot lomar leYisrael. God told Moses the mitzvot, and Moses told them to Israel. Ube'emet, and in truth, eino dome shomea mipi harav. And he says, we have a text, he quotes the Gemara here, a text indicating that when we have kind of second-hand information, we don't always trust it in the same way as we do if we were to hear it from the main source. He says, "Velo kiblu oto sechel hagadol she'amar Hashem leMoshe." And initially, they did not accept that great understanding that God said to Moses. Perhaps they didn't really believe in all of the details of the mitzvot, in the understanding of the commandments that God told Moses. Rak, except for ka'asher asu mitzvot Hashem, except when they did the mitzvot of God. Then, mechamat asiyat ha-mitzvot, hisigu ze ha-sechel ech shekibel Moshe mipi Hashem ha-mitzvah hahi. It was because of the actual doing of the mitzvah that they attained the understanding of how it could have been that God commanded these to Moses. V'zehu, and this is in relation to the verse, Vaya'asu b'nei Yisrael, ka'asher tziva Hashem et Moshe. And Israel did as God commanded Moses. Ba'oto hasechel, asher tziva Hashem et Moshe. With that same understanding, the Kedusha Levi says, that God commanded Moses. Oto hasechel hisigu bishat atziyat ha-mitzvot. And it was that understanding of the mitzvah that they achieved at the time of actually doing the mitzvah. V'zehu, and this explains the verse. V'ya'asu ka'asher tziva Hashem et Moshe. And they did as God commanded Moses. Hine, Moshe amar le Yisrael ha-mitzvah b'zeh ha-sechel she'amar lo Hashem ha-mitzvah hahu. Behold, Moses told them the mitzvah according to that which he got from God. Aval Yisrael lo hisigu ha-mitzvah hahu ba'oto sechel ad she'asa ota. But Israel did not understand that mitzvah, understand what Moses got from God until they actually did it. So, here is an opportunity for us to talk about why we don't always connect to mitzvot. When we hear about a mitzvah, we say, what do you mean you take a palm frond and a willow and myrtle and a lemon thing and you shake it together? How can that make any sense? And you can imagine the Israelites saying that to Moses. What do you mean, I take a candle and I say a blessing on Saturday nights? How does that make any sense? What the Kedusha Levi is saying is, you only really get mitzvot once you do mitzvot. You can't understand them by learning about them, by reading them in a book. You can't understand them by watching somebody else do it. You can't understand them, by really wanting to do it, but not actually getting up and doing something. But it's only through doing mitzvot that we come to understand how they connect us with God. And I would add to this, it's not that you can do a mitzvah one time and immediately feel a connection to God. It's not that you can do a mitzvah and it's automatically easy. I think what he's saying here is there's an opportunity when we do mitzvah to connect with God, but in order to actually reach that, you have to act. You can't just learn about it. You have to act and do a mitzvah, and you have to repeat it, and you have to get comfortable with it enough to the point when you do it, you can do it wholeheartedly. You can do it, from your soul. And then there's a chance that you'll understand, as Moses did, the secrets of the mitzvot and how they connect with God. But you can't do it just by reading about it and by learning about it. The only way to do it, to understand how these mitzvot do connect us with that which is much bigger than us, with God, with the universe, with the divine, with that which we don't, with that which we're striving for. The only way to do it is through doing it. The only way to connect is through actually doing the mitzvot, says the Kedusha Levi. Okay, wonderful. We're going to put aside the Kedusha Levi now, and we're going to look at a text from this book. So this book is sayings and teachings attributed to the Baal Shem Tov. Now, the Baal Shem Tov was the first Hasidic rabbi, born in roughly 1700. He is the reason that Hasidic Judaism exists today. Now, he never wrote a book. He never had, his disciples never, wrote a book for him in his name. Rather, this is compiled from quotes from everyone else's book. So the Kedusha Levi mentions the Baal Shem Tov, and so those get put in here. And the Kedusha Levi is one of many early Hasidic rabbis. If you're wondering who the others are, I would suggest you watch the series that we did initially when we started the Hasidut class. You can learn about all the early Hasidic rabbis. And their quotes attributed to the Baal Shem Tov are all compiled in this book. In this Torah portion, we read the Shema for the first time. And this teaching is on the Shema. This is the Baal Shem Tov explaining a kavanah. And I want to say a kavanah is an intention. When we say a prayer, we just say the words with our mouth, but what we feel in our heart, what we're thinking about when we say that prayer, that is kavanah. That's the intention behind the prayer. And the Baal Shem Tov is going to share a kavanah for the Shema. He says, the verse, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. HaKavanah Shel Echad. So the intention that one has when they say the word Echad, Shel HaYichud Shel Kriyat Shema. When one says the word Echad, that is to say that moment of unity of the Shema. That word Echad is the most important word here, he says, because that sums up the unity of this message of the Shema. He says, Lekaven she'ein bechol ha'olam rak hakadosh baruch hu shemalei kol ha'aretz kevodo. He says, one should intend when one says the word Echad, when one says the word one, that there is nothing else in the entire world except for God, who fills the entire land with God's glory. Ve'ikar hakavanah, and the essence of this intention, sheha'adam yasim et atzmo le'ayin ve'efes, that a person makes him or herself nothing, zero, nada. That one, in that moment of saying echad, you imagine yourself to be efes, to be zero, to be nothing. Ve'ein ikaro rak haneshama shebo, and that one's essence is nothing except the soul that is in that person. So he says, when we say echad, we're not done yet with this comment. He says when we say echad, we're saying the word one, but we imagine our intention is that we are nothing except for that soul. Shehu chelek Elohei mimao, because our soul is part of God. Nimtza she'ein bechol ha'olam rak hakadosh baruch hu echad. And it's found that there's nothing in the entire world, only God, and that is echad. That is the singularity, the unity we're talking about here. Ve'ikar ha'kavanah be'echad she'ikaven shemalei kol ha'aretz kevodo. And the essence of saying of this word echad is that one should intend, one should hold in their hearts that God's glory fills the entire world. Ve'ein shum davar panui mimenu, and there's nothing empty from God. Everything is God. When we say the Shema, to sum up what the Baal Shem Tov says, when we say the word echad, we ought to imagine ourselves as purely our soul, which is the part of us that is, he says, actually part of God. And that there's nothing else in the world besides God. Now, the reason I love this text is because there is a beautiful parallel here, which harkens back to the Kabbalistic idea of how the world was created. You might have heard the word tzimtzum before, which is God contracting God's self, making room for creation. Initially, there was only God, to kind of simplify the story here. And then God contracted God's self. God made an empty space which made room for creation. And that's the only way that creation can happen, is by God limiting God's self. Now, here what the Baal Shem Tov is asking us to do is a kind of reversal of that. God creates the world by contracting God's self and making room for creation. The Baal Shem Tov is saying, what is our job during prayer? We make ourselves Ephes. We make ourselves Ayin. We take who we are and we contract ourselves in order to make room for God. That we fill ourselves with the knowledge that we are nothing but God. And in doing that, we create this unity, a reminder to us that we are God and that the whole world around us is a microcosm of that, of God. It starts with us. It starts with a personal tzimtzum, saying that I am nothing except for God. Taking away that piece of us that we hold on to say, this is my unique identity. And saying, no, I'm going to fill that with the knowledge that it is only God. That my soul is my true identity, and my soul is that which is connected to everything else. I want to kind of end that idea with, a notion of how to imagine souls. I'll give you two examples. I had a teacher, Rabbi Feigelson, who always kept a beautiful vase of water on a table in her living room. And we asked her, what is the deal with this vase of only water? She said, this water is not just water. This water came from the ocean. And it's a reminder to me of where I come from. My soul is taken from, the vast ocean, which is the unity of God, which is the essence of everything. And then someday, it'll be poured right back into that great ocean. Another way to imagine, our souls here is, I like to imagine bubbles. When you blow a bubble, it appears that the bubble is separate from the rest, of the space around it. Just from a thin little membrane. But really, the inside of the bubble and the outside of the bubble are essentially the same. And when the bubble pops, it goes right back, to the great, to the air, to that which is, all around it and has been all around it the entire time. Though from the bubble's perspective, it was always a separate piece. Though in fact it was connected, it was unified with everything around it, even though it didn't seem like it. So the Baal Shem Tov is saying, when we say the word echad, we want to hold in our hearts that reality that we come from that which is much bigger than us. And that when we pull ourselves back, just for a moment, only when we say the word echad, you can't live like that. You can't live thinking, that you have, that your identity is only tied up with God's, that everything is one. It's so hard to actually go about the world like that. We need our separateness, our identity, our distinctiveness in order to function. But for that one moment, when we say echad, we pull back, who we are, and we say, actually, I am only God. And everything else around me, that is only God too. Okay, these are the texts I wanted to teach tonight. I'll open it up for a moment. If there's anybody on YouTube who has a question, comment, concern, Yochev, you're welcome to write in Portuguese here, and I will bring it over to Google Translate. And I'll also open it on the Zoom to my mom and Steve if you have any questions too. And then we'll sign off for tonight.
So wondering if that, I'm kind of loving that picture, the idea of kind of zeroing in on echad, and I'm wondering if that would be the moment that we could really use to depict the experience of Tselem Eloki?
Yeah, so what my mom asked on Zoom is if we can use that moment of Echad to hone in on the idea of B'Tselem Elohim. I would say go a step further. B'Tselem Elohim is still, a division. You have Elohim, well, then B'Tselem Elohim means in the image of God. You can imagine Tzel is like an idea of like more of a shadow, almost like you have God and then you have God's Tselem over here. I think what the Baal Shem Tov is asking us to do is go a step farther than B'Tselem Elohim, than made in the image of God, and to hone in on the idea that maybe we just are God.
Is that close to like what I used to do TM, and they used to talk about you try to achieve like this, what they would call God consciousness, that level of God consciousness.
Yeah, so it is. I'd say I don't know enough about transcendental meditation, to say if it's similar or not. But if the goal is, to reach a point where you understand the unity of things, that you and everything around you actually are made of the same stuff and are the same stuff and are connected in an unbelievable way, then yes, I'd say it's similar to that.
Is it dveikut?
It is, I think, the ultimate goal of dveikut. Dveikut meaning close to God. Here you're so close to God. Remember, actually, we had shared a story initially, and I think it was the Baal Shem Tov story, where you had a traveler coming to a great castle, and there were a series of walls and doors leading to the inner chamber of the castle. And everybody knew that the king was in the inner chamber. But at every single entrance to the door, there was a bag of coins. And most travelers would get to the first door, to go in, to the castle. And they would see the coins and they would take them and they would run. Now, the really wise travelers, the ones with self-control, would get to maybe the third or the fourth, chamber series of walls until they finally, were too enticed by the coins, and they finally took them and walked back. But then there was one, particularly driven traveler whose goal was only to see the king, wanted so desperately to see the king. And he was able to go past the first, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth chambers, passing all the doors and the coin, bags getting larger as he was walking through, and then finally went in, managed to make it to that central chamber and saw the king. This was his goal, and then upon seeing the king, he realized that the whole castle around him was an illusion. And that he himself was an illusion, and that all there was the king. So that, so that story, is attributed to the Baal Shem Tov too, and so yes, it is dveikut. Dveikut is like the gravity that brings you to that moment, and so echad. When you say the word echad, it's meant to be kind of you're finally reaching that goal of. It's almost beyond dveikut. It's unity. Yeah, you're not close anymore because you're one.
Yeah. You should know that there is several words, according to Ben Yehuda, may he rest in peace, who wrote the first dictionary, obviously, of modern Hebrew. Mm-hmm. And he wrote that photograph and camera come directly from that word used, B'Tselem. Mm. Exactly because that is what it meant. Mm. A copy, in the image of,
yeah.
Shadow,
Sure. Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah. Okay, so next time you take a picture, with your camera, you can use even that as a moment to remember that we are actually all one. Okay, so with that, goodbye to everybody on YouTube. Goodbye to my mom and Steve on Zoom. And we'll see you next week. Okay, bye, everybody. I think I like having you guys on Zoom, actually. You can